My name is Emmanuela Bakola, and I'm an associate professor in Greek language and literature, and I teach the whole of Greek literature at Warwick. But my specialization is Greek theatre, and so much that one of my babies at Warwick is the Warwick Drama Festival, which some of you may have attended already. So I was away for 18 months writing a book on cosmology and Aeschylean tragedy, the tragedy of Aeschylus. Kind of thinking about how to put the cosmos on the theatrical stage. And I'm back and happy to teach tragedy again. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to so there is a million ways in which you can talk about the reception of epic in tragedy. I mean, in fact, the shadow of epic poetry is so large that there is nothing that hasn't been profoundly influenced by it. Okay, so if you think about kind of reception of Homer in tragedy or in lyric or in all these other canonical genres, and you think only about similar phrases or similar language, and this is just only the tip of the iceberg. So there is a huge range of ways in which to engage with, in which we can detect the engagement of Greek drama with Homer. But I've decided to, because I know that you have Aristophanes' frogs in your curriculum, I've decided to talk to you about something that is that will be probably more useful for your studies. That's one thing. So I will start from frogs, and I will go on and look at the only or one of the very, very few works of Aeschylus which have which draw directly from Homer. The second thing I wanted to say is the themes of angers and grief. I'm going to talk about this theme or these emotions essentially as one. You have to, I don't treat them as two separate emotions. I will explain why this is important. I look at them as a continuity of emotional experience. Okay, so of course, Achilles' anger, Achilles' wrath in the Iliad will be central. Now, Aristophanes' frogs. Can I see a show of hands, like how many of you have done the frogs actually, which is in the A-level syllabus? Yeah, not very many hands. Okay, so now, the frogs, if you haven't read it, I completely recommend it, because it is an amazing source for us to get a glimpse of how ancient Athenians and Greeks more widely perceived these huge tragic poets. So what you have in that play is, in the second part of the play, is a contest between Euripides and Aeschylus. Now, Euripides and Aeschylus have been constructed by Aristophanes as caricatures that are meant to embody what the audiences, what people who attended their plays thought about them. Oh gosh. Oh gosh. I got panicked. So, we're talking about perception. Okay, we're talking about perception. Now, the frogs constructs Aeschylus the comic caricature of Euripides and the comic caricature of Aeschylus that appear in the frogs. Okay, they have some, their construction is based loosely on historical facts about them and their art, but it's mostly about their portrayal is mostly perception of them, okay? So they are constructed by Aristophanes in order to reflect a common perception of them. Now, one of the ways in which Aeschylus is constructed, to get to the point of my talk, is his relationship, his enthusiasm, his ways of engaging with Homer. So Homer, Aeschylus in the Frogs, unlike Euripides, is the ultimate Homeric poet after Homer himself. Now this is now the polarity that we see between the two poets constructed in this poetic contest. So on one hand, I've used here some images which correspond actually to the imagery that the Frogs uses. On one hand, you have Aeschylus as the representative of old, okay, so tradition. So he is constructed as, and remember please, there's nothing, they're not necessarily corresponding to reality, as the poet of raw power, okay, natural inspiration, whose language is so Homeric that it flows like a powerful river, okay, and whose poetry also has the weight of Homeric epic. Okay, this is how half of Frogs portrays Aeschylus, and also whose poetry deals only with noble things, concealing morally reprehensible aspects of life, including sexuality. Okay, and also who profoundly respect tradition and appeals to the few but noble. Okay, this is the construction of Aeschylus in the Frogs, and epic, and Homeric epic in particular, and Iliadic epic in particular, looms large in his portrayal. And he is constructed to the comic construction of Euripides, who is, made by Aristophanes to embody his common perception as the maverick, okay, the poet who has a clever and inventive craft, who is known for his adventurous and kind of edgy, use of language, unlike Aeschylus, who is respectful of grand language, and whose poetry deals with issues closer to everyday life. And also mesmerizes the audiences, but not the lead, the hoi polloi. And he's also subversive of tradition and potentially dangerous. Now, epic has no place in a poet like Euripides. Of course, as I said to you, there is some, some grain of truth in all of this, or some kind of fire which explains the smoke, but overall these are constructions. Still, what we see from that is that portraying Aeschylus as utterly Homeric is extremely important for Aristophanes. It's extremely important in how Aristophanes and the contemporary audiences understand Aeschylus. So as soon as the second part of the prose starts, we have Aeschylus introduced with Homeric imagery. There is this, wonderful choral ode. Those of you who have studied the Frogs, it's definitely worth paying a lot of attention. And this is where Aeschylus, both Aeschylus and Euripides, are introduced according to the stereotypes that I mentioned earlier. And for example, Aeschylus is introduced with Homeric imagery of warfare and horses. We will have helmet glinting struggles of tall-crested words as a man fends off a thought-building, so that man is Euripides, as a Euripides fends off a thought-building hero's galloping utterances. Okay, so epic and warfare and horsey imagery for Aeschylus. And throughout the entire poetic context, the Aristophanic Aeschylus' language, imagery, rhythm, the meter of his songs, and even, we must assume, his costume suggested that Aeschylus was perceived to be utterly Homeric. But, you know, this is only where the project of constructing the Homeric Aeschylus starts. The Aristophanic Aeschylus himself is actually portrayed, so the caricature of Aeschylus is portrayed not just as, you know, a poet who enjoys and knows his Homer, but he's constructed in the model of Homeric Achilles, okay, who in the Iliad was portrayed as grieving and angered, in angered silence, for Agamemnon's offense to his honor, and later for the death of his beloved Patroclus. So this theme of anger is an angered silence and grief is picked up in the construction of Aeschylus in the Frogs, who, when we first see him on stage, this is a still from the Warwick Drama Festival in 2019 when we did the Frogs, is portrayed as sitting on his chair, unmoved, probably veiled, and in angered, I would say closer to pissed off, in angered silence, and a degree of grief for the fact that he has to face the despicable Euripides and compete for him for the chair of Tragedy. So yes, so in Frogs he's similarly silent, out of anger, but also out of grief, but grief of the comic sort, okay? And we read this in places like, why are you so silent, Aeschylus? You hear what he says. You have to imagine that Aeschylus was silent for a long time, before that, and kind of looking wrathful and in grief. And his anger is particularly pointed out when Dionysus warns the chorus that there is a hurricane hurtling our way. This is when Aeschylus gets up to defend his poetry from the accusations of Euripides. Now, by making anger and grief, albeit of the comic sort, the most striking feature with which he introduces his caricature, Aeschylus, Aristophanes picks up a major theme which firmly links the tragic poem to Homeric poetry, specifically the Iliad. Okay, and let me remind you, I'm sure you know, that Achilles' anger and grief is a central structural theme of the Iliad. If you remember, the Iliad starts with the invocation of Achilles' wrath, continues exploring what led to this wrath, and then the whole of 24 books are basically structured around Achilles' decision to withdraw from battle, and then in light of his beloved Patroclus dying, to rejoin it at the end. So this is how the Iliad starts. Same goddess, the anger of Peleus' son Achilles, and its devastation, which would pain thousandfold upon the Achaeans, hurling their multitudes to the house of Hades, strong souls of heroes, but gave their bodies to the delicate feasting of dogs, of all birds, and the will of Zeus was accomplished since that time when first there stood in division of conflict Atreus' son, the lord of men, and brilliant Achilles. And those of you who don't know or don't remember why Achilles was offended and enraged by Agamemnon. It's because Agamemnon had to give up Chryseis, a woman that he had taken as his prize, and instead asked for Achilles' prize, another woman called Chryseis. So now the focus on Achilles' wrath and grief, and you will see now how in almost every passage that refers to Achilles' wrath, grief is also part of it, is pervasive. And we see it, for example, immediately after we are told about the conflict between Agamemnon and Achilles, and this is what we read. So he spoke, okay, said Agamemnon. Grief came upon the son of Peleus, and his heart within his shaggy chest was divided in counsel, whether he should draw his sharp sword from alongside his thigh, make the rest scatter and slay the son of Aeschylus, or whether he should check his fury and restrain his heart. So achos, this word for grief, which also means, fury, but also, kind of deep pain in one's psyche for an offense that they have suffered. Both of them, both grief and fury, are parts of what make Achilles withdraw from the battle. And again, later on, I mean, so, yeah, as I was saying, and as you know, those of you who have read the Iliad or know about the Iliad, the descriptions of Achilles' wrath and grief are overwhelming. So, for example, we start again. We see the passage on the catalogue of ships in Book 2. When we get to the Myrmidons, but the Myrmidons were not mindful of ill-sounding war, so they were not taking part in the war, since there was no one who would lead them into the ranks, because swift-footed radiant Achilles lay idle among the ships, angry because of the girl, fair-haired Chryseis, the girl that he lost, whom he took from Lyrnessos after much toil. He lay there grieving for her, but soon he was about to rise up. And now I'm starting to introduce you now to how this idea of anger and grief was engaged with in iconography soon after the Iliadic poems, or soon after the Iliadic poems became canonical. So, for example, oh no, please. Is there any way that we can? So can you all imagine a burrito Achilles? If you have a burrito Achilles in your minds, I think you will kind of capture the iconography of Achilles in wrathful grief or in grieving anger, very successfully. Oh, can we leave it like this?
Yeah.
Okay, so so here is our Achilles as captured by the imagination of painters. This is an early 5th century cup, so about 1 to 2 centuries after the composition of the Homeric poems, certainly around the time that the Homeric poems became canonical. And this is one of the many, at least 20 iconographical examples we have of the veiled Achilles. And this one shows Chryseis, the woman that Agamemnon took away, being taken away from him, and him hiding half of his face and his whole body in kind of a rich himation, hiding him away in grief and anger. Another one of the many passages where this emotion of grief and anger are combined comes from soon after Patroclus' death. We said that as Achilles wasn't going into battle and the Greeks were being very heavily pressured by the Trojans, Patroclus decided to go into battle and he got himself killed, especially because he was wearing Achilles' armor. So, growling really intensely, like a lion with a great mane whose cubs a deer hunter steals out from under his protection. This is a kind of a likening of Achilles with a lion who has lost his cubs from a dense wood. And the lion grieves when he returns later. And he ranges over many mountain depths, tracking the monstrosities, in the hope that he may find him somewhere who really bitter anger seizes him. Okay, now I'm gradually here inviting you to also think about kind of, in modern psychological terms, we tend to separate kind of these emotions of grief from emotion of anger. But really, if you think about it, especially in cases of grieving, for a bereavement, anger is a big part of what modern psychologists call the kind of the 5 stages of grief. And really, Iliadic poetry, and I think also iconography, as we see here, capture this, complex, profound emotion of grief, anger, or anger, grief. Now, as I said, Achilles is portrayed as veiled in at least 20 examples of surviving iconography. This is a painting that corresponds to Achilles when he was visited in Iliad Book 9 by the embassy to, and Odysseus attempting to persuade him to come back into battle and accept the gifts of Agamemnon. And then another a reference, a bibliographical reference here of one of the very, very few modern scholarly pieces which look at anger and grief as essentially, one continuous, emotional state, rather than separate, and how these are captured in veiling, the gesture of veiling in both iconography but also poetry and prose. Now, what is surprising and what has really bothered the scholars is that in the Iliad we don't have a veiled Achilles. Okay, we don't have Achilles in any of these stages of his Briseis being taken away from him, muffled up in a cloak. We don't have him when he's visited by the embassy. We don't have him when his mother visits him later on with his new armor. How are we to interpret the popularity of this representation of the Homeric Achilles? Should we say that he was invented by iconographers? Or, as most scholars think, and this is now we're coming back to the main topic, by Aeschylus in his own rendition of the Homeric Achilles and his wrathful grief. Now, how do we know that Aristophanes represented Aeschylus on stage, veiled and in silent, grieving anger? Because we have this line from Euripides making fun of him, making fun of the older poet as cheating his audiences. He'd always start by having some solitary character sit there muffled up, say Achilles or Niobe, not letting us see their face, or hearing even this much of a peep. So we know then that The reference here is of the comic Euripides to a trilogy, a famous trilogy by Aeschylus, which took its topic from, which thematized the anger of Achilles. And this is what is known as Achilles trilogy, and includes the Myrmidons, the daughters of Nereus, and the Phrygians. Based on the Iliad to a remarkable degree, and corresponding approximately to books 9, the embassy, 18 to 23. So Achilles' return to battle after the death of Patroclus, and 24, the ransoming of Hector, the return of Hector to corpse to his father. So since Aristophanes is making fun of the veiled Achilles and his silences, kind of wrathful silences, are we allowed to think that the veiled Achilles on stage was an Aeschylean invention which influenced painters so widely? In fact, we have many poignant veilings of heroic males as attempts to conceal profound, uncontrollable grief and sometimes anger, including a portrayal of Odysseus in Odyssey 8. This is when Odysseus is in the palace of the Phaeacians, and Odysseus now is listening to the bard singing about the Trojan War. These things the famous bard was singing. As for Odysseus, he took the great purple cloak in his mighty hands and drew it down over his head, and he covered his fair face. And whenever he would begin again, and they would urge him to sing, the best of the Phaeacians, the bard, since they were delighting in his words, covering over his head again, Odysseus kept on singing a lament. Then all the others did not notice him shedding a tear, but Alcinous, the king, alone noticed and perceived it sitting near him, and he heard him groaning deeply. So, there has been a discussion about this, but I think it is fair to say that there's no need to assume that the veiling as portrayal of anger and grief was Aeschylus' own innovation, but rather a theatrical rendition of a cultural practice, a specifically Hellenic, so specifically kind of Greek cultural practice. I'm sure we find it in other cultures as well, but via Homer, because Homer represents so many of his heroes engaging in this gesture, and specifically what we can say about Aeschylus is that he makes this gesture and the theme of grief and anger of Achilles central in his trilogy, as it is central in the Iliad. So the theme of Achilles is anger and the grief for the loss of his honor due to Agamemnon, and later his grief and anger for the loss of Patroclus formed the backbone of the Iliad. Aeschylus, in his reception of the Iliad, maintains this theme as central in his Iliadic trilogy too. And this is where Aristophanes really got it right, by presenting for the first time we see the comic Aeschylus on stage is in this silent, veiled and grieving posture. So we know that although the Achilles trilogy of Aeschylus has not survived, we know from several testimonies, we'll see some of them, that Achilles sat silent and veiled for a long time. This is how the play opened. Okay, very, very striking tableau. Ignoring the pleas of the Myrmidons to go to the aid of the Greeks. The second fragment survives from the frogs. Again, one of the choral lyrics that Euripides makes fun of. Fear Achilles, why, when you hear of the suffering and slaughter of men, yea, do you not advance to their rescue? The other fragment, where Achilles is pleaded with to go and help the Greeks, do you see this glorious Achilles, the toils of the spear-rabbits Greeks, whom you are betraying by sitting idle with your heart? But eventually, when word came that the ships were being set on fire, in the first play of Aeschylus' trilogy, Achilles,
So in the first play, the Myrmidons, Patroclus must have persuaded Achilles to let him go into battle in Achilles' armor. Sadly, and probably after a choral ode, as the convention is in theatre, the shattering news of Patroclus' death came, and now Achilles' anger is amplified and becomes additionally anger and devastating grief for his beloved Patroclus, who is no longer alive. And we have this fragment, which probably comes from this from the scene of Achilles learning about the death of Patroclus. Cry for me, the living, more than for the dead. All I had is gone. Now, this is from the first play, the Myrmidons, from which we have a lot of evidence comparatively, a lot of fragments, including your frogs. From the second play, The Daughters of Nereus, we don't have very much evidence. We know that the play was called The Daughters of Nereus because the chorus was the Daughters of Nereus, a sea deity, okay, who come on stage talking about their life at sea. We also know from other fragments that during this play, Achilles, Hector's good fortune of having killed Patroclus was celebrated, but ultimately Achilles must have re-entered the battle, killed Hector in revenge, and came back to participate in the funeral rites of Patroclus' body. Now, before Achilles entered the battle, however, we had a scene from with his mother bringing Achilles his new armory. And this is something that is also captured by painters. Again, Achilles in the same posture. And we can read and imagine how that scene would have played out via the words of Homer in Iliad 18. Again, Thetis here insists in a combination of grief and anger for her son when she goes to Hephaestus to ask him for the fashioning of a new shield. So the second play, although this is a very strong likelihood, it is not certain. We don't have any evidence where that Achilles definitely was presented in this way. But we also know about a very, very common and predominant technique of Aeschylus in the theatre, which is to construct mirror scenes. So this scene mirrors the scene where Achilles is in grief, for losing Briseis. So we have the development of a non-verbal expression of grief and anger on stage, followed through the second play of the trilogy, most likely. But we are certain, though, that in the third play, the Phrygians, or the ransoming of Hector, Achilles appeared again in the usual fashion of Aeschylean mirror scenes, veiled and in grieving anger for the death of Patroclus. Once again, we know this also from commentators on the frogs, that the play opened with Achilles veiled and in devastated grief or anger for Patroclus' loss. What has happened until now is that, as we said, Achilles had re-entered the battle, fueled by murderous wrath and uncontrollable grief, and he had devastated the Trojan army, killed Hector, and abused Hector's corpse in the way that even the gods found appalling. This is how the
So the third play of the Achilles trilogy, the Phrygians, roughly draws on Iliad 24. And this is how the Iliad 24 starts. Only Achilles wept still as he remembered his beloved companion, nor sleep, whose abuse all come over him, but he tossed from one side to the other in longing for Patroclus, for his manhood and his great strength, and all the action he had seen to the end with him, and the hardship he had suffered, the wars of men, hard crossing of the big waters. Remembering all these things, he let fall the swelling tears, lying sometimes along his side, sometimes on his back, and now again prone on his face. Then he would stand upright and pace, turning in distraction along the beach of the sea, nor did dawn rising escape him as he brightened across the sea and the beaches. And then, when he had yoked the running horses under the chariot, he would fasten Hector's corpse behind the chariot so as to drag him, and drove him 3 times around the tomb of Menetius' fallen son, and then rest again in his shelter, and throw down the dead man and leave him to lie sprawled on his face in the dust. And then the poet goes on to talk about more of Achilles' wrath and unappeasable, grief. So overall, book 24 is probably a book that really everyone should read. It's a profoundly touching book. And this is how the summary goes. So dismayed now by Achilles' continued abuse of Hector's body, Zeus decides that it must be returned to Priam. Led by Hermes, Priam, the father of Hector, takes a wagon out of Troy across the plains and into the Greek camp unnoticed. He clasps Achilles by the knees and begs for his son's body. Achilles is moved to tears, and the two lament their losses in the war. After a meal, Priam carries Hector's body back into Troy. Hector is buried, and the city mourns. Now, this was probably the plot, the dramatic action of the third play of the Achilles trilogy of Aeschylus, where now, and this is now important, this is what I want you to keep, that the anger part of grief is likely gradually superseded, and in fact gives way to a new kind of grief. Okay, a kind of grief that the two men can share as they both grieve over, the loss of their beloved ones in the war. So a kind of grief that is not devastating, but is uniting in humanity and also embracing of its fragility, especially as both Achilles and Priam know that their end is coming very soon. So the two enemies, Achilles and Priam, are united in their grief. Troy mourns Hector, as the Greek camp just recently mourned Patroclus. So some conclusions now. So it's really, I think, immaterial whether Aeschylus or anyone else or the painters invented, the veiled Achilles. What I think is really, impressive and worth keeping in mind is how, this kind of veiled, silent Achilles in grief and in anger is a poignant theatrical rendition of the central Homeric theme of anger. Especially as it is mirrored play after play. Again, we saw how this posture appears play after play. Very much like in Homer, in Aeschylus, anger and grief is central and a foundational theme. And in performance, it is manifested in a powerful embodied pose. And each play recalls the previous one in a mirroring fashion. But to come full circle now to the frog's portrayal of Aeschylus in relation to noble Homer, and especially to the question whether Aeschylus was a traditionalist, an upholding of tradition, you will remember that according to frogs, Aeschylus was supposed never to show objectionable things on stage because they corrupt the young and they corrupt his audiences. never showing aphrodisia, so things of Aphrodite, sexual stuff. He concealed them. This is what, tongue-in-cheek, Aristophanes presents his caricature of Aeschylus as. However, in a wonderful stroke of luck, what we have from the Achilles trilogy are three very poignant fragments where the Aeschylean Achilles, the actual Aeschylean Achilles, speaks of his profound homoerotic and homosexual, actually not only homoerotic, but homosexual relationship with Patroclus. Okay, we have these three fragments. And you did not, this is Achilles when he's crying over the body of Patroclus, and you did not respect the sacred honor of the thigh bond. I'm grateful that you were to those countless kisses. And another one, and I honor the intimacy of your thighs by bewailing you. And another one, and yet to me, because I love him, this, which is a gesture probably the audience would find distasteful. This is not loathsome. Unlike in the Homeric Iliad, where the topic of the bond between these two men, the homosexual bond between these two men, is only implied, in the Aeschylean Iliad, this profound erotic bond is what makes Achilles' anger and grief infinitely stronger, and even more poignantly humane, and even more devastating. Thank you.